Greetings, Marsh here, and welcome to episode 102 of my modded Factorio playthrough. In this episode, we need to use helmod to plan for the ingot stage of our new ore sorting setup. Enjoy! There's quite a few technologies involved in this. So let's check each casting recipe to make sure that we have all the relevant technologies in here. So we already have iron 2. And there's no more efficient version of it that we have available to us. Just taking the iron ore, processing it, adding some coke, and then we get our ingots. There is a new tier of copper that we can research. It doesn't make making the copper ingots any more efficient, but it does unlock the ability to make rolls and coils. Basically, these are a more efficient way of transporting resources. So for example, a copper plate just takes up one square on a belt, while instead of making copper plates, you can make a sheet coil which is made of 4 copper plates. So essentially, that would quadruple the throughput of any belt or train or transportation system that you use to transport these coils. And it's not any more or less efficient. This is 80 molten copper, which makes 8 plates, and that is 2 sheet coils. Now, it is important to research and implement this technology as soon as possible, because later on, when you have blue science, you can unlock the second tier of making coils using coolant. And it actually becomes more efficient. So if a sheet coil here has 4 plates per coil, that's 16 total plates, but you only have to put 14 plates worth of copper into it. So it actually improves the throughput. So you want to research and implement this stuff as soon as possible to get that efficiency bonus later on. And the reason why you want to implement it as soon as possible is because it adds an extra step. It means anytime that you have something that needs to use copper plates, you first have to take these copper coils and cut them up into the plates to go into the machine. So no longer will assembly machines just be able to take items off of a bus. You'll have to break it down for them first. So it's an extra step, and it means retrofitting pretty much every single assembler in the entire factory. So that's annoying. It's a huge logistical improvement, and it's a minor efficiency improvement later on with the next tier of research. So it's definitely worth doing. But also, it unlocks the ability to make copper cables. And that uses the same efficiency and density of 4 times dense. The advantage here is that a strand casting machine can make copper wire way faster than an assembly machine can. So this will actually simplify your assembling setups where you no longer have to make copper wire. You actually cast the copper wire, and then there's going to have to be an assembly machine to cut those wires up from the coils. But then you can just use them in assembly machines. So it actually greatly improves throughput and makes the bus and the assembly line actually smaller. Not to mention, copper cable by itself is something that you don't normally bus because it's less dense than the copper plates that went into it. But now that you can make copper coils, you can actually bus copper coils and thus copper cable. So it's definitely an improvement we want to take. So we'll pick that up. It looks like that unlocks tin as well. And it's basically the same thing, where we can make sheet coils of tin rather than tin plates. But also, it lets us make tinned copper wire. And that was a step that we had to do in many electronics. Is first we have to make copper wire, and then we have to tin the copper wire. That's always an annoying sequence of steps. Well, now we can take the molten tin and molten iron directly as an alloy and make those copper wires and save the assembly machines all of the effort of having to do this. That's definitely something we can do to improve base logistics. It also lets us make the tinned copper wire more efficiently as well, once we have access to new research. And we can do the same thing with lead as well. So we'll grab that. And the same technology exists for nickel as well. We don't use nickel for as much, but still, we'll take the improvement while we can, and it's a little bit more green research that we can do. We need to be able to make the new resources we're now producing, like aluminum. This sequence is a little complicated, but it's not too bad. Where you need to make aluminum hydroxide through aluminum ore and sodium hydroxide, so now we finally have a use for all that sodium hydroxide. But it also means we have to have sodium hydroxide to make aluminum. And then that gets processed into alumina. And then we add carbon, and that creates an aluminum ingot. And then those ingots can be smelted into molten aluminum, and then we can make aluminum plates. And the ability to make the sheet coils is unlocked behind blue science, so we'll just have to ship it the normal way for now. And we also have silver here. Silver is very straightforward. Silver ore goes in, ingots come out. Then you turn that to molten silver, and then you get plates. Also, it unlocks the ability to make silver wire, which is a major component of circuits. And we also need to make some zinc. Process is a little interesting for zinc. In a way, it's kind of like silicon, where it takes some silicon to make silicon. But what we do is take the zinc ore, add oxygen, and curiously, molten lead. And then as a result, we get our zinc ingots, lead ingots, and sulfur dioxide gas. Now it takes lead, but it doesn't actually consume any, because the lead that goes in is lead that comes out. And it's kind of weird where you make molten lead from ingots, and then the output of this is ingots. So you basically just need to seed it with some lead, and then the system just works and you don't have to worry about it anymore. And then we can make the molten zinc, and then make plates. We have some more research we need to do, but unfortunately, the queue is full for now, so we'll just have to let it go through that. This research is going to take quite a long time. And I'm thinking we are on the cusp of needing to expand this wall, where we need to leave some of this space open for potential expansion. It needs to be left open to the left here, in case we have more methods of sorting. And it needs to be open above, in case we have the next tier of ore sorting machines, which would go here. And then the ore sorters would be pushed up a tier somewhere up here. And they might compete with this, but we'd deal with that when that time comes. But we definitely want to leave room for this. Otherwise, if this is all too compact, then if we want to expand it, we're going to have to rebuild the entire thing. This is kind of okay to cluster together, because if we need to build bigger setups or build more, we could just kind of tack it onto the end, add some pipe spaghetti or whatever. We'll make it happen. It's not that big a deal. And for the major things, like oxygen, we can expand it down. But if we take space here, it'll make expanding the ore sorting setup very difficult. So we're going to need to go up here. So where would ore processing happen? Well, it wouldn't be in this square, which is a very convenient place. It would probably have to be up here. Doing it to the left doesn't make much sense to send belts all the way up here. So it makes the most sense to kind of just have the belts go straight up, do some undergrounds to get through this area, and then do it here. And this may not be enough room for it. So we may want to grab some more space. Plus the biters are getting pretty close to the wall. And we do have some amount of time. We're going to have to wait for that research to happen. So we might as well go running around, kill some biters. See where the next wall should be. I have no idea what the shape of this landmass is, but perhaps we should go exploring. Certainly have enough ammo. Plenty of ammo to go shooting, so might as well. Because the base is doing pretty good right now. There's a couple of improvements we can do, but none of it's really worth pursuing right now. So let's see if we can prepare to push the wall forward. Well, that big thing's out in the middle of nowhere. It's shooting biters at me. Whew. Oh, the web is so slow. See, well, we finally made it to another coast. So maybe let's follow this around and see if this is a coastline. These biters are a lot bigger. Since they break into smaller biters, it takes quite a few shots to kill them. This thing is so noisy. You actually can dodge its shots if you try. Man, that thing's huge. Man, almost barely didn't have enough for that. Hey, the research is done. Let's get this base cleared out. Lots of little biter artifacts to pick up. There's probably no way I can get them all. They're just too small. So where have we ended up? Over here. Well, that's probably an offshoot, so we can kind of go south and come back over and see what it looks like. Unlocking zinc gave us access to some new alloys. First, it gives access to making solder with tin and zinc, so no lead, which is pretty nice. We can also make solder coils, which is nice because that's something we had on the bus too, so we can make those 4 times as dense in the logistic network, which is always nice. And then we have 2 new alloys we need to make. One very important one is brass, which we have been waiting on, which is copper and zinc, making brass plates, which we will grab. Looks like it unlocks zinc processing as well, which gives us brass pipes, brass gears, brass chests. But I'll wait on that until we actually have the resources to build all of that. Because brass plates goes into a couple things that we need. Especially brass pipes, which you can see are a major component of a lot of higher tier machines. So we need that for sure. And also, we can do gunmetal smelting, which is copper, tin, and zinc, to make gunmetal plates. And gunmetal does go into a few things, like armor, but specifically it goes into bullet casings. And bullet casings go into all of the high tier bullets, which are just high damage magazines that are more realistic as far as the resources that go in, but push down the chain so you don't have to go through all of that just to make some ammo to defend yourself at the beginning of the game. And when we have access to that, one thing we can do is make Invar gunmetal armor, which is a much stronger armor than what we have now. But that will have to wait until we actually get those things researched. And another smelting type we can do is the tier 2 of bronze smelting, which is copper, nickel, and tin. So we might as well grab that while we can. I think that's all of them. Well, we'll let that research, and I'll try to get back to base here. Probably have to fight my way through some biters again. But we still have a little bit of time to kill, since we got more research. There we go, we found the coast on the other side. Man, look at the size of that crotinium patch. Some nice rubite as well. Made it back. Only used a tiny portion of our ammo. We certainly used some of it, but compared to the total, maybe 5% of the total ammo we have got used up, but hey, it got used for something, which is better than it just sitting there not getting used at all. So we got all of our research done. The second step out of 3 to making our plates is making our ingots, which is this middle part right here. It's pretty straightforward. Some of the ores have to go through a processing step. Some do not. But ultimately, they go into a blast furnace that consumes some kind of fuel, and then outputs ingots which get combined in various combinations to make the different alloys that we need. How are we doing on resources? Looks like copper's working its way down. The warehouse did fill again, and I moved some of that copper over to the new bus just to make it go somewhere else. But now that we're doing some research, it looks like it's working through it again. So what kind of numbers are we looking at here? Well, as far as manganese is concerned, we are producing it from these two methods, and if they were on all the time, it would be making 25 manganese ore a second. To make manganese, we just add coke. But if we had blue science, we could research the way of increasing manganese efficiency by 50% by taking processed manganese and adding sulfuric acid and making manganese cathodes, which can then be made into ingots. So it's important to recognize that either we already have the ability to increase our ore efficiency by 50%, or we will in the future. So we need to keep that in mind when deciding how much ore processing should we have. So if we can produce 25 manganese ore a second, then if we built a setup that can handle, let's say, 30 manganese ingots a second, that is something we can easily do. Right now it's a little bigger than it needs to be, but in the future, when we get that 50% performance increase, we will easily be able to do it with that input. And actually manganese is a byproduct anyway, so we might want to have more than 30 per second, but let's just see what 30 per second looks like for now. Let's add each individual ingot type. So we want to make manganese ingots. And let's say we want 30 per second, or red belt. And blast furnace 2, which I believe is the technology that we are still on. Yes. I wonder if we can make the next tier. No, that is behind blue science and white circuits. So you can see that it really only requires a few blast furnaces to do that. So we could increase this efficiency pretty easily. So it's important with this setup that we want to build it with some space for each item to expand in production if it needs to. But let's go in here and set the default fuel from charcoal to wood blocks. And I'll cover that a little bit later. See, it requires almost no wood blocks at all, but it requires coke. And specifically, we need to calculate this all out because we need to find out how much coal products we need, because every single one of these blast furnaces requires some kind of fuel. Although in this case, since it requires coke as a fuel, we should probably set this to coke. I mean, we could kind of rig the system up in a way to consume two different fuels, one that it uses for the process and one that it uses for the fuel. The way you would do that is you would place the machine down and then fill up the fuel belt, let it take in the fuel, and then have the fuel populated inside the inventory of the blast furnace, and then put the coke down and have it fill up. So as long as it never ran out of fuel, it would keep consuming your different fuel. But if it ever ran out of fuel, then it wouldn't. And it's a little too janky for my opinion. So I just run these things on the fuel that they use for ingredient with their process. It just makes things simpler. So that's the manganese ore. So I will remove this sorting type here. So it's not in our calculation. So now if we were sorting each individual basic ore, we would get this kind of output. It's also important to recognize that with some of these ores, we're using catalysts now. Iron, copper, lead, and tin use catalysts, and we have 2 belts of output. So with catalysts, we can make 60 ore per second, the most efficient way. But that's not the maximum that our base can produce. It could actually produce 75 if we were using every method possible. So although the primary method to make iron would be, say, using catalysts, we might also be getting iron as byproducts from other processes. And that's where the higher number comes in. So these are all just kind of guess numbers. We don't really know how much the factory is going to be producing at any given time. We just want to be prepared for it. So how much iron and how much copper should we produce? What if we wanted 120 iron and copper ore each? That's 4 red belts. Well, we don't actually need 4 red belts or 120 input because these will be improved in efficiency by 50%. So to make 120 plates per second, we actually only need 80 per second of iron and copper, which we kind of do have here. And one convenient thing about 120 is that 120 iron plates a second is 30 iron coils per second. So even though we're having 4 belts of ingots being produced by this, we're actually only going to produce 1 red belt of actual product, and it's going to be 120 iron plates. So I think doing 120 for copper and iron work, because you see these numbers are much higher than the rest of them. We do use a whole bunch of iron and copper, so we can come in here and do iron. We'll do the tier 2 iron and say the output is 120. And 13 blast furnaces. It's a few, but it's really not that many. And then it's running on those wood bricks. And then the processed copper gets made in an ore processor, and that's bigger. It requires 40 of those. And our input is the 80 copper. Let's do the same thing for iron. Tier 2 of iron. This requires some coke. So our output is 120. And we need to process the iron. And let's switch this to use coke, since that's the fuel that it's running on. And there we go. However, we mustn't forget that we can make steel ingots from iron ingots, so we need to do that. It's just a 4-to-1 ratio there. However, with blue science, it'll unlock additional tiers of making steel. Like we can make an alloy with silicon or an alloy with manganese. And these are actually incredibly efficient because when you consider that to make iron, you can do iron at a 50% ratio with silicon. So you cut your iron in half by doing that. And then when you make the steel, you can cut the iron input in half again because you can spike it with half of it being manganese. So this is extremely important with just stopping steel from nuking your iron production. And we will be able to do this along with the other production methods later on. So we definitely want to leave some space in here for this to occur. But for now, we do need to make that steel. So we'll come in there, say steel ingot. And we're already producing pretty much as the factory can produce with iron. So let's just set steel up to use all of it in case we would need to use all of it. So 120 goes in and 30 comes out. So that's definitely a lot of steel. But now note that iron is no longer on this list because it's going into steel. But that'll require that same 13.4 blast furnaces, so I'm sure that number is going to be common between all of these because they're all producing the same amount of resources. So what about some of these lesser ores? Well, you can see that with lead and tin, we're making 30 per second of those. And 30 per second would make 45 per second of ingots. But since it's a little easier to work with full belts, let's just plan for 60 per second of lead and tin. We can't quite put that out, but I like having equal numbers of belts instead of 1.5. So we'll come in here, let's say lead, but the more efficient method that uses carbon. Say we want 30 per second and set this to use carbon. Then it needs lead oxide. And we need to do the processed lead. Oh, but I meant to do 60 per second for this, for lead. There we go. So yeah, it requires a little bit more lead that we can put out, but we will have a large buffer warehouse, so we can produce more than the factory's output for a period of time. So this will work fine. Okay, now let's calculate for tin, tier 2. We want 60 per second. Set this to use coke. And then process tin. So 6.7 and 20 ore processors. Modest setups. It's just when you have all of these setups next to each other, you start to have some big numbers. So let's go down another belt. And let's go with 30 items per second. Which resources should we make 30 items a second of? Well, we have nickel and silicon. Silicon can make 30 per second. Nickel, not so much. It's a little low. But close enough. So nickel and silicon will do 30. So we come in here in tier 2 of nickel. We want 30. And the nickel cathode requires sulfuric acid. And then there's the 20 of nickel per second going in. And let's do some silicon. Output 30 per second. And it requires some silicon ingots in itself. But it just pulls it from its output, goes back to the input, so it works fine. So we need to make trichlorosilane, which is hydrogen chloride gas and silicon. And let's do silicon there. It won't take up that much space to make the hydrogen chloride gas, and we've already done it previously over here. It's a pretty simple setup, so we can kind of place it anywhere when we need to. So we'll worry about that in a bit. So there's our 2 more resources. So now, what else do we have to work with? Well, the last tier of belt we have is 15 items per second. And 15 per second seems like a good number for aluminum. Aluminum can easily keep up with 15. I wonder if aluminum should be 30 per second too. Similar to nickel, it won't quite be able to keep up, but mostly. These, however, zinc and silver, are perfect for 15 per second. They fit nicely. But we'd be losing out a little bit if we were only making 15 aluminum per second. We definitely want the ability to make ingots to be more than our production capacity, to meet or exceed the production capacity. We don't want to be less than the production capacity, because then we just won't be able to make our full output, and that won't be very efficient. So let's add aluminum to here. See, we want 30 per second, and set that to carbon. So that requires alumina, which requires aluminum hydroxide, which finally requires aluminum and sodium hydroxide. Now we should have quite a bit of sodium hydroxide sitting around. 13,000. But even that 13,000 will only produce 4 times that of actual ingots. So we'll actually run out of it pretty quick. So our aluminum production is going to be limited by sodium hydroxide. And that's not the easiest thing to create. We would basically have to electrolyze saline water, burn the hydrogen, and throw away the chlorine in order to produce sodium hydroxide. It's not an easy thing for us to do right now. Later on, we can make it with sodium. It's a byproduct of other processes. Or we can make it from a sodium hydroxide solution, and we can make it from sodium carbonate, which is a byproduct of other processes as well. So for now, the amount of aluminum we get is solely based on how much sodium hydroxide the base makes. So we want to keep that in the back of our heads of what are we using aluminum on, and don't go nuts, because it's actually a fairly precious resource. Like, unlike silver and zinc that we can just make with tier 2 ore sorting as much as we want, aluminum is actually limited by sodium hydroxide. So it's something to keep in mind. We don't want to abuse our production of aluminum, because it's going to seem really good in the beginning, and then it's going to just stop when we run out of sodium hydroxide. So we got to be careful with that. We've got 2 more ores to add in here. We've got zinc, which we wanted 15 zinc per second, and that requires zinc ore and also molten lead. And let's make molten lead from lead ingots. And when we add that process in there, it just goes back and forth and it disappears. And now we just have our inputs and our outputs. And we need to do silver, which is right there. We want 15 per second. And that's a very simple process as well. So let's check. I think we need to have 11 ingots. We have iron, which isn't here because it's making steel, and copper, lead and tin, nickel and silicon, which is the original 6, and then the 4 new ones: manganese, aluminum, zinc, and silver, which is our 10, and then the 11th is steel. So that's what we're looking at. And that's the end of this episode. In the next one, we need to take it a step further and use the information that we now have to plan for all of the coal products that need to go into making the ingots. Thanks for watching. I'll see you later.